Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 International Perspectives Conference Speaker Series. My name is Noah Stewart.
And I'm Mary Grace Kinathia.
And we're the co-directors of this year's conference. Originally, the International Perspectives Conference would have been hosted on Principia College campus in September 2020. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to shift gears and are excited to present this alternative format of a virtual speaker series to you. Before we get to our speaker tonight, we would like to personally thank all of the students that contributed to this conference in some form. They include Nicodemus Cosmas, Delwis Glockpour, Kiona Spur, Richie Sarmiento, Chris Michael Mawere, Mallory Saylor, Dana Cady, Leslie Ambricato, Brandon Robles, Mara Tay, and Emma Devine. This virtual speaker series would not have been possible without them, and we are extremely grateful for all of their work over the past year.
The theme for this year's speaker series is social isms: racism, classism, sexism, colonialism, nationalism, heterosexism, and tribalism. This is some of the most common issues societies around the world have struggled with and continue to face. These isms express a tendency to create division between groups of people that are different or think differently, leading to an us versus them mentality, where the other, in most cases, is seen as the enemy. What prohibits us from seeing the values and beliefs we share to build meaningful relationships? Sadly, every culture has its own set of structures that stop us from doing so. However, through education and action, we can do our part to overcome these limiting belief systems and reach out to form a society that respects and supports everyone.
The 2021 International Perspectives Conference Speaker Series aims to identify these social isms that appear to divide us and present solutions to build the bridges we need to overcome them. The speaker series hopes to inspire a generation of changemakers that is aware of the isms we fall victim to and takes action to correct them for a better future.
Now, to share with us his perspectives on this theme, we're excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Athol Williams. Athol grew up in the South African township of Mitchell's Plain during the apartheid rule, which constituted a system of institutionalized racial segregation from 1948 to the early 1990s in South Africa. Athol realized the importance of education at an early age and went on to become the first person to receive a master's degree from 5 of the world's top universities, including the University of Oxford, London Business School, London School of Economics, Harvard, and MIT. After a successful business career, Athol is now focused on his poetry and nonprofit work while teaching at the University of Cape Town. He founded the literacy NGO Read to Rise and has won multiple awards for his literary work.
Tonight, Athol Williams will share with us his life story and how it relates to our theme, socialisms, in his talk titled Learning to See. So without further ado, it is our pleasure to introduce Athol Williams.
Hi, I'm Athol Williams. I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a poet and social philosopher, and quite happy to be sharing a few thoughts with you today. I've called this talk Learning to See, and I want to explore a few ideas around this idea of seeing differently, of seeing ourselves differently, seeing the world differently, and perhaps seeing new possibilities. The premise of my talk is that how we see each other determines how we treat each other. So how we see each other determines how we treat each other. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix the talk with a sharing of some thoughts and some poems. So you'll get both social philosopher and poet in this talk. And perhaps let me start with quite a short poem, which provides some context for what I'm going to talk about. This one's called World Peace. If I draw a circle around me, and you draw a circle around you, then I am us, and you are them. And so we use all our strength and skill and ingenuity and resources to harm each other. If we draw a circle around both of us, then we are brothers, and there is only us. And I think this poem, while sounding almost a bit cliched with this idea of the circles and us and them, I think so importantly talks to this issue of learning to see differently. If you think about how you see a baby, you see a baby in a particular way, probably simple-minded or not able to process complex ideas, and so we treat a baby in a particular way, given that understanding or that assumption of who they are. So we speak to the baby in baby language. If you think about how you regard a friend versus a stranger, the friend you might see as being someone close to you, and so you trust them more, and so you might treat them quite warmly. A stranger, you'd be more reserved, and so might treat them more reservedly, perhaps even hostile. If you recall how your parents treated you as a teenager, often parents see us still as their babies, as their children, and so treat us that way, much to our irritation. But this idea of how we see each other determining how we treat them can be illustrated by some of those examples, can be illustrated by the poem World Peace. Because if I see me and those like me or those with me as us, and I see those outside of my circle very differently as them, there's always the chance I begin treating them very differently to the way I treat us. And so this is this idea I want to explore. Because what if we see them as inferior to us? How do we then treat them? What if we see them as unwelcome? How do we then treat them? And worse, what if we see them as enemy? How do we treat them? And I think this same question can be asked of how we see nature and how we see animals. Because again, depending on how we see nature and animals, if we see those existing for our consumption or for our benefit, we treat it in a particular way. That's a very important topic which I'm not going to touch on in this talk. So I'm focused primarily on how we treat each other as fellow humans. So we are conditioned to see each other in a particular way. We are conditioned, often even taught, to see each other in a particular way. And so this idea of a better world, in my mind, requires us to interact with each other differently. But before we get there, it requires that we see each other differently. And so I've got to see my enemy not as my enemy anymore. I've got to see the unwelcome person as not unwelcome anymore. I've got to see the stranger as friend. I've got to see, if I'm going to say this to my mother, she's got to see me as adult, not as child. So we've got to see each other differently before we can begin interacting with each other differently. Importantly, in this idea of a better world, of us engaging with each other differently. And so this idea of seeing differently, as I said, we've got to see each other differently before we can begin engaging differently. But linked to this idea of seeing others differently, we've also got to see ourselves differently. And I think this is a very important element of this idea of seeing, of learning to see. You've got to see yourself differently because you've been taught how to see yourself as well in the context of a broader community and a broader society and a broader world. And so it's this interactivity between how I see you and how I see me that really dictates how I behave. And I want to tell you a bit of my story and a bit of my background of growing up in South Africa during apartheid to give you a sense of what I mean about seeing myself differently. As many of you would know, apartheid was a policy in South Africa. It was written into law that people were treated differently based on the racial groups in which the apartheid government slotted you into. So we had 4 racial groups: white, black, colored, Indian, with a whole sort of bunch of histories around those. But depending on which category you were slotted into at birth, your entire life was actually dictated to. So for me, up until the age of 24, I lived in a world that saw me as a second-class citizen. This meant that every aspect of my life reminded me of this idea that I was a second-class citizen, and reinforced this idea that I was a second-class citizen, but what I could do and couldn't do. So there were beaches that I couldn't go to because of the color of my skin. There were buses I couldn't use. There were schools I couldn't go to. There were restaurants I couldn't go to. There were people I couldn't marry purely because of this racial classification. So by the time I was 24, that's the only world I'd known. I'd known this world that saw me as a second-class citizen. And I couldn't change that world. But what I could change was how I saw myself. And I think that's the critical point. I rejected this idea that I was a second-class citizen. So as much as all the indoctrination through my education, through the media, was reinforcing this idea that not only would society see me as a second-class citizen, but society also wanted me to see myself as a second-class citizen. And that I rejected. As early as my teens already, I understood that I was an autonomous being worthy of equal morality, of equal respect, of equal dignity. And I understood that through my education was going to be the way I was going to exert this autonomy, exert this demand for respect, for dignity. And so I took it upon myself to educate myself. And under the apartheid rules, I was forced to go to particular schools. And these were second-rate schools where you got a really low quality of education. The education system was designed for me to be a laborer. But I wanted far more than that. I wanted to be an engineer. And I had no role models as engineers because before me, no one went and became an engineer. In fact, of my entire community, no one had ever been to university, let alone gone and done engineering. So I attended my day school, but on top of that, I then attended night school, which was a school for adults, which gave different sort of perspective on education. I attended every weekend class I could possibly find to reinforce my mathematics education, to reinforce my physics education. I went to university classes where I could. I got textbooks from other schools. And effectively, the proper standard of education is what was taught at white schools. So through hook and by crook, I managed to get the textbooks that were taught at white schools. And so I studied those. And I just set out to ensure that I got through high school with high enough grades that when I applied to the university to go and do engineering, which was, by the way, a white university, which in those days were beginning to allow a few little black students in who were exceptional students, I wanted to make sure that when I applied, the excuse could not be that my grades were not good enough. And so I educated myself and took it upon myself to do this. I then miraculously got into the engineering program. But of course, I was now in a university which was designed and set up and institutionalized for whites. And I was among this tiny minority of black students who were there. And so suffered immense, I was ostracized, I was marginalized, I was sort of pushed to the side. I had incidents where I was refused to use the public buses. I had the police raid my apartment, my dormitory at university, because it was just this oddity of this black guy studying engineering at this white university. But I persevered and got through and graduated in the minimum time with a degree in mechanical engineering. One of the first black engineers in the country. And certainly the first in my community to have ever completed an engineering degree. This idea of seeing yourself differently was what gave me my social agency, what gave me this belief that I could rise above my circumstance. If I'd seen myself as society wanted me to be seen, I don't believe I would have been as ambitious and as driven as I was. This ambition continued and has continued throughout my life. Beyond working as an engineer, I had this dream of studying at MIT in the US. And I applied to go to MIT, got into MIT, but could not get any funding to pay for the studies. I couldn't really get funding to pay for accommodation. But what I did manage to get was a company willing to pay for my flight to Boston. And so at the age of 24, in 1994, soon after Nelson Mandela had become president, the first black president in our democracy, I got on a plane, left South Africa for the first time, went to Boston, and because I had no money for accommodation, no money for tuition, I lived homelessly in Boston. So I lived in public spaces at MIT, and while doing my MBA. I then completed the MBA, and then my life changed quite dramatically. It was a rags to riches story, where I now had this incredible job working in management consulting, was earning really good money. I could now support my family and do quite interesting things. But even then, I'm now in this new world, and I've got to be asking myself, how am I seeing myself? How's the world seeing me? I'll fast forward, and after a number of years of living quite lucratively, of having a number of senior executive jobs in the US, in the UK, back in South Africa, which included me being a partner at Bain & Company, me being the director of strategy for one of the largest financial services companies in South Africa. I was living the bachelor life. I had 6 beautiful cars at one point, which was completely excessive, which included a Rolls Royce, a Lamborghini, a Jaguar. But I was enjoying the fruits of my labor, and often you can argue, well, why not? But there came a point where, again, this message of learning to see, because I had achieved freedom in many ways. I'd achieved political freedom by then, I'd achieved economic freedom by then, and with that came a sense of social freedom. But when I looked around me, I saw my fellow South Africans living, continuing to live in chains, economic chains, social chains. And so for me, I was struck by the words of Nelson Mandela, who said that to be free is not merely to cast off your own chains, but to live in a way that enhances and respects the freedom of others. And I paraphrase that as meaning I'm not free until we all are free. And so in my 30s, late 30s, and as I was turning 40, I began changing my perspective entirely towards saying, well, if I am now free, I need to be working towards uplifting those around me. And so I sold all the cars, sold the mansion I had, quit the corporate jobs. And my wife and I then set about thinking quite deeply about how do we see the world? We were learning to see anew, to see ourselves in this world and saying, what role do we play? So as opposed to a world where we were trying to break free for ourselves, we're saying, how now do we use our resources, our skills, our capabilities to enable others to free themselves, to uplift others? And that then became our focus. Before I continue on that story, let me share 1 or 2 poems with you to give you the sense of just where I was at and how I began to think and see myself differently. The first one is again a short poem, which just goes back to my time as a student in Johannesburg under apartheid, and that resilience, that sense of I will not give up, that I talked about earlier. It's called Still Standing. Still standing, still breathing, still angry. Still growing, still striving, but still angry. Though they shattered his innocence, though they shook him cold, though they put apartheid's guns to his head and punched their fists into his back, he's still standing. They've won because he's still angry. He's won because he is still standing. And the next poem I want to share with you is this idea again of this resilience, of making the decision to say, I'm going to see myself differently, and going to demand the respect, and live the way that demands and requires and gives me the dignity I believe I deserve, that I believe everyone deserves as humans. One finite life. Short this life is, just one I've got. Finite in tenure, whether I like it or not. Death is embracing fear, replacing dreams with I cannot. Life is taking a new step, having a shot. I will do the impossible. I will change this world. I'll give hope to a despairing nation. I'll give bread to a starving girl. I'll break all the records. I'll do what's never been done. I'll give and know love. I'll be a billionaire of fun. You can whip me with your words. You can bash me with your lies. You can chain me to the ground with your rules. You can stab me with your eyes. I'll forgive all personal harm. I'll ignore all acts of mean. But I will not forgive obstruction of my purpose and dream, for I am a Superman. I'm a king. I will not just lie down. I will get up and take to wing. I will rise up as sure as the sun, as sure as the springbok, I will run. As sure as the eagle, I will fly. Because I choose to live until I die. What will you do with this day, this hour, this minute? Will you fill it with dull and fear, or will you live it? I will not tolerate any foe, no matter weapon or munition, especially if that foe is within me in the form of fear or lack of ambition. Short this life is, just one I've got, finite in tenure whether I like it or not. As sure as the eagle, I will fly. Because I choose to live until I die. And hopefully by those two poems, you get the sense of the poet seeing himself quite differently to a second-class citizen. And so learning to see myself in a way that recognized in my mind, recognized my dignity, the equal moral standing I believe I held as a human, powered my ambition and powered my determination to stand tall. And that is why I then drove myself towards pursuing education. I finished high school, which in and of itself was amazing in my community, then going on to earning an engineering degree, and then eventually wanting to go to MIT. Now, if you're living in apartheid, in a township, a slum, in squalor, with crime and deprivation around you, the idea of dreaming of MIT is not a dream or an ambition, it's a fantasy. But I dreamed of studying at MIT and a few other universities, as I eventually did. But I wanted to study at MIT, and so I applied to MIT and miraculously got accepted. But I had no money to pay for my studies. But what I did manage to get was a company willing to pay for my flight to Boston. And so at the age of 24, the first time I'd ever left the country, I traveled on my own to the US, to Boston, arrived there without knowing a single person, without having a phone number to call, without having any money to live, to pay for tuition. But I had this letter that said I was accepted as a master's student at MIT. And so I lived homeless in Boston. So I lived in public spaces around the university campus until eventually, again, through ensuring that people saw me how I saw myself, as a person worthy of opportunity and a person worthy of respect and of dignity, I managed to get and find ways of paying my way through university. And then after business school, after earning an MBA, my life really went from rags to riches. And so I was able to pay all debts I had, support my family, and now I could now live this life of indulgence in many ways. I went quite extreme in this path of indulgence, buying myself a beautiful home, and enjoying cars. Cars was my thing. And so at some point I had 6 cars. I owned a Lamborghini, a Rolls Royce, a Jaguar, I had brand new BMWs, and obviously went overboard, but it was the sense of, here I am now, celebrating, enjoying the economic freedom and the social freedom. But even then, learning to see challenged me to see myself, my new self now, my now economically free self, in a world where around me people lacked economic freedom. And so very quickly I turned my attention away from myself and from self-indulgence. And some would argue I had every right to be indulging because I'd lived this life of government-sanctioned deprivation. But my attention then turned towards uplifting and freeing others. And so I sold the cars, sold the house, and really just simplified my life and began to focus on the role I could play in society. And so as I saw myself differently, as I saw others differently, it changed the way I behaved. I actually began to see the indulgence of my past as quite despicable. And the philosophy I adopted was around 2 things. One was I was going to try and uplift people and help. And so my wife and I began working with children to help them read and improve their literacy. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I could inspire people to rise above their circumstances, because indeed it was my ability to rise above my circumstances, my self-belief, the inspiration I felt that allowed me to overcome those obstacles. And the second area of my work was around breaking down constraints, whether it was laws or policies or social norms, because those were required for my freedom to be realized. And so I've done a lot of work around what an ethical society is, resisting corporate corruption, and so working at these 2 ends. Importantly, this idea of learning to see that was now guiding my work away from accumulation for my own benefit, but towards this better world I had this vision of, challenged me then to see others differently. And I got challenged in ways, and people challenged me around the poem in the beginning I read, World Peace, which said, us and them. And the challenge was, well, what am I saying? Am I saying we should ignore difference? That we should all be colorblind to difference? That we should all just become one melting pot of humanity? And while at a spiritual level, I do believe we are one humanity, but this is not what I was saying. I was not saying we should abandon our cultures, our sense of community, our religions, all these things which we seem to say because they are different create conflict. I was saying we need to acknowledge that difference, celebrate that difference, but think very carefully about the implication of the difference. Because often it's the implication of the difference, what meaning we attach to it, that causes conflict, not the difference itself. And so I could say I'm Christian and she is Muslim, and say how beautiful, rather than because I'm Christian, I'm us, and because she's Muslim, she's them. And therefore, I love these people and hate those people. Because the way we've been conditioned and taught is that once you define those who you love, you also define those who you hate. It's an if-then statement. If love X, then must hate Y. And I reject that idea. I think if love X, you can also love Y. But we've got to learn how to do that. And I think we learn to do that by seeing each other differently. And so the following poem was an effort on my part to begin to imagine what a world could look like. What could politics look like? What could society look like if I'm talking about us being different, celebrating our difference, but not leading to conflict. This poem's called Bumper Cars. In Cuckoo Land, all people drive in bumper cars. Little odd-shaped fiberglass cars with thick rubber bands around the waist, like those we rode at the fair as kids. Everyone has the same sized car with identical power, They go to work or school or the grocery store in cars of every possible color, a kaleidoscope of dots in Brownian motion, like looking into a microscope at the life in a vibrant cell. But there are no roads, no lanes, no traffic lights, no stop streets. They drive wherever they like. And occasionally, when their cars collide, they wave with all fingers, not just one, smile pleasantries, and continue on their way. And this was the image of the society when I said a better world or a better society. This was the image that came to mind of us all moving in our Brownian motion, bumping into each other, but us living free lives. But when we bumped into each other, that didn't descend into conflict. And as the poem says, we smiled pleasantries and continued on our way. The question then became, what could this rubber band be? Right? So around these cars that we drove at the carnival that bumped into each other and didn't cause any harm. And what's interesting when you watch children at the carnival in these bumper cars, they actually want to bump into each other. So as much as we as grown-ups have said, well, let's keep difference apart, actually bumper cars, you want the difference to come together, because it's in this contestation of ideas that we build a richer society. Not just this platitude about diversity, but real contestation. That we need the bumper car, we need the rubber band around the car to ensure that conflict doesn't arise. And so a question for us in imagining this better world is, what is this rubber band? And the best that I've conceived of is the idea of compassion. Because if I see you as someone of equal moral standing to me, as someone with dignity, someone worthy of respect, someone I care about, not even intimately, but care about from a standpoint of your standing as a human being, I wouldn't want to harm you, regardless of how much we are contesting ideas, regardless of how much we are differing in our ideas. And so the idea of compassion, of love, at a level of recognizing recognizing humanity, for me, is a powerful idea that guides my work and will continue to guide my work. And I offer to you as a challenge to think about how you can bring that into your work. How is it that we can recognize and celebrate our differences, not erase them, not be colorblind or be gender blind, or all these areas we're trying to wish away, but acknowledge them, celebrate those differences, but then find this rubber band of compassion, this rubber band of love that says we can find solutions because we can contest these ideas while still being in communion with each other. And so perhaps let me share a poem. I've got two poems that I want to share as I close. They both are unpublished, and so quite happy to share those with you. These ideas, this idea of compassion, this idea of love, of this rubber band, sounds idealistic, and I've got no problem with it sounding idealistic. I think many of the great things that humanity has achieved started with idealistic ideas. We've just landed an Earth originated machine on Mars. That started with an idealistic idea, putting man on the moon, overcoming slavery, breaking down apartheid. These all started down with idealistic ideas, naive ideas, fantasy ideas. But I believe that we make the big strides in society with some of these ideas. So I'm quite happy to toss my idealistic idea into the ring. But an idea that says the moment we see each other differently, we begin to treat each other differently, and that offers us great hope. So the first poem, as I'm closing, is called The Problem with Love. And it talks about this idea of drawing close together when there's difference. The problem with love. This is the problem with love. It draws us to woman when we are man, to gay when we are straight, to black when we are white, to wheelchaired when we can walk. Love draws us to Muslim when we are Christian, to the hungry when we have plenty, to the vulnerable when we have power, to the refugee when we are citizen. It is love that draws us to the shackled when we are free. Love seeks to widen us, to include them. So takes us across a bridge, an uneasy crossing, for love can draw us to what we fear, to that which might bear no love for us. This is the problem with love. It draws us to the other side, to a world often unknown. And though much is unknown, this we know, that we must go wherever love calls us. And so that is my wish for you, that you will, in your work, in your outlook on life, in engaging with others, in seeking this better world, that it is guided not by just the platitude of love or the platitude of compassion, but this real sense of seeing each other differently. When you look at that person, who do you see? What do you see? And then engage around what you try to bring to them or convince them of or share with them or take from them. So in closing, my final poem is titled Learning to See, which is the title of my talk. And I think it quite deeply explores this idea of seeing differently, which is a challenge for me continuously. And I offer it as a challenge to you, that you might begin to reflect upon how you see people today, how you see yourself today, who you consider us, who you consider them. And in that consideration of us and them, what that means in terms of how you engage with them. And I think we follow a hopeful path when we can begin to celebrate difference, but build those bridges between those communities of difference and draw each other closer through compassion and through love. Learning to see. I want to learn to look deeper, to see more. Even as his fist strikes at my cheek and her words rip at my soul, even as they awake a volcano of violence in my chest, I want to learn to see them and not be blinded by pain. I want to see past his actions, her speech, their anger. See through his religion, her beliefs, their cultural norms. Beyond his clothing, her skin, the sound of their voices. I want to nod to their being, but see more of their humanity. I want to look deep inside him. I want to see the unseen within her, to find that mystery flame that burns there. And I know I will see hurt there and disappointment. And I know I will see dreams there and hope. And I know that once I see and learn to see with such eyes, I will see the real him, the true her, and I know I will see myself.
Well, thank you, Athol, for the beautiful poetry and for the insightful talk. And thank you for everyone else for tuning in.
And we will have a 20-minute live Q&A session on Zoom following this talk. You can simply use the link at the bottom of this website to join, and we'll be happy to see you, and Athol will be happy to answer any questions you have about his talk. Then also, we have another talk coming up on April 2nd by Jeffrey Walter, and you're most welcome to join and listen to that talk as well. Just be on the lookout on our social media sites on Facebook and Print IPC on Instagram to get updated on the date and time. See you on Zoom.